in the days that followed, things got worse. My wife started having night terrors. She started talking and crying and even screaming in her sleep. I can wake her up sometimes, but about half the time, I just have to ride it out with her. Nights like those are the worst. She screams and kicks and cries, and no matter how hard I try, she won't wake up. At first, I could understand what she was saying, but now it's all gibberish. She used to say stuff like, "No, no, he's our son, no!" Or, "Please, don't, please!" But now, she says half words and stuff that sounds like nonsense. Most commonly, she would say, "Ah, sit, ta!" But other times, it was stuff like, "Pi, Oz, Oz, Oz!" She would just repeat these things over and over in her sleep, as she cried and kicked and screamed, and I was left to helplessly watch and try to soothe the baby. Every morning, she woke up without any memory of the night before. She didn't remember having any bad dreams or anything. Even on the nights where I could wake her up, she still didn't remember anything. She would just look up at me with wide eyes in the darkness and ask why I'm shaking her. I suggested she go to a therapist after about a week of this. She agreed with the condition that I went with her, which I was more than happy to oblige. We found a sleep specialist downtown and scheduled an appointment for that weekend. We went together with the baby and sat in the stuffy waiting room while rocks grew in my stomach. For some reason, I couldn't understand. I was nervous. We told the therapist what was going on, and that she'd been speaking nonsense in her sleep. He was a thin man with long, bony fingers, which he pressed against his lips as we told our story. When we were finished, he calmly told us his assessment. "I don't think you need a professional to tell you that this has something to do with your subconscious. Something in your mind is not being expressed outwardly, so when you sleep, it's able to come out in the form of these night terrors." He suggested hypnotism. I laughed out loud at this. There's a lot I can believe in, but hypnotism is a stretch, even for my belief system. I looked up at my wife, whom I expected to have the same expression of bewildered doubt, but instead, her expression was wooden. She agreed. The therapist asked for absolute silence. He said that if the baby starts to fuss, I would have to take him out. He said this only may work if the conditions are perfect. I expected him to pull out a pocket watch like they do on television, or maybe a ballpoint pen to swing back and forth, but instead he told her to sit up on the couch with her hands on her knees and her palms facing upwards, and close her eyes. He talked to her in a low, focused voice and began to paint pictures of a meadow, then an ocean, and so on. It took about 15 minutes before I realised that my wife was completely relaxed. Her chin rested against her chest, and her shoulders hung on her like wet laundry. He asked her to say her name. She did. He asked her to tell him where she was. She said the attic. He asked which attic. She said in our house. I frowned. She'd never been up in the attic, and I wasn't honestly sure where the entrance was. He asked why she was there. She said that's where the stairs were. He asked what stairs. She said the ones in the ceiling in the hallway. He asked her what she was doing. She said she was hiding. Hiding from what? Hiding from Manada. Who is Manada? It was at this point that my wife began to scream. The car ride home was unusually quiet. She didn't remember anything she said, and I was too afraid to dive into questions. I stayed up late that night after she went to bed. I sat on the couch, sipping from a glass of Jim Beam whiskey and staring at the space between me and the television. My mind was racing, and no matter how many glasses of whiskey I drank, I couldn't help the feeling that I needed to check something out. I needed to find the attic, or at least, I needed to make sure there were no stairs in the hallway. I've done my own fair amount of home improvement projects, and I knew that although it was unlikely, it was possible to cover up an attic entrance with a fair amount of plaster and paint. With the top of the broom handle, I started at the end of the hallway where the baby's room was and began to thump against the ceiling. I thumped hard against the ceiling, listening to the hollow sound on the other end, and was about to give up and put the broom away and laugh at myself for being so silly, when, at the other end of the hallway, I heard a solid thump. I hit again around the sound and found a space about 3 feet wide and 3 feet long, where there was no hollow sound. I pushed against this square and saw, very faintly, that as I pushed, the square flexed against the paint. I don't know what I would have done if I were sober, but I retrieved a chair from the kitchen and put it up where the hollow sound was. I groped around for the seam. Then, with my pocket knife, I began to slit the paint apart. As I cut the last bit of paint and plaster with my knife, I saw the wood begin to sag. I slipped my fingers onto the lip I'd made and pulled the wood down. With little effort on my part, the entrance to the attic plopped down, knocking me off my chair and revealing a set of stairs leading to the attic. I sat up, ignoring the pain in my head and elbow, perplexed with what I'd just discovered. I pulled my phone out and flicked on the flashlight and stepped up onto the first step. The wood creaked, but seemed like it would hold. I stepped up, not planning on crawling into the attic, but just intending to look. It was dusty and covered in insulation, but at the end, just beyond my reach, was a large cardboard box. I stepped up further, placing my knee on the floor of the attic and extended my hand until I could get the box. It was surprisingly heavy, and as I pulled the box close, it caught a corner and tipped over, spilling its contents across the attic floor. My mouth went dry as I saw what was in the box, and I was filled with a sudden, overwhelming sense of unease. The box was filled to the brim with old Polaroid photos of infant children.